Okay, welcome once again, Dambisa, to Vienna. As we all heard that you've been here for quite a while, or sometimes often. My name is Barbara Kolm, I direct the Austrian Economic Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. There are two occasions why we do this. First of all, the most important, that finally Dambisa is here in Vienna and will accept our Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award tonight. And let me introduce actually the gentleman who is the reason why Dambisa is here. This is Magister Manfred Kastner, CEO of Cat Oil, but actually most importantly, he founded Vision Microfinance and is a very visionary individual, libertarian, believes in individual liberty and opportunity. And we had a discussion last year when the second Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award was awarded to Niall Ferguson, who would be the next person in line and who would definitely deserve it. The idea of the Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award is we give this award to individuals, to scientists, to journalists, to people who are outstanding in their work, what they do, who are very outspoken and defend actually the values of individual liberty and freedom, and who want to preserve it, who want to educate or who educate the public in one way, directly or indirectly. As indirectly, for example, the first winner was the Literature Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa, who does this in a very delicate, indirect way with his books and his stories and his novels, whereas the economist and historian Niall Ferguson does it in a very direct way and approaching, and as does Dambisa. She, with her publications and her work, is also very outspoken, very direct, and very upfront with what she does. And this is why we chose her, why the entire Hayek board agreed to this suggestion, and we are very proud to have you here in Vienna. Thank you. And the second reason, we combine this gala with our students' competition. So we run a competition throughout Austria, throughout schools, where we have students compete for mobility for the next generation, which means it's not mobility from A to B, geographic mobility, but most important, as the Austrian Economic Center, or as Hayekians, we really believe in social mobility, is upward mobility. And this can only be done by education, by competition, by believing in the achievement principle. These are the values that we, as the Austrian Economic Center, defend, and this is why we are so happy to have Dambisa here with us, because she's one of those people who speaks up on these issues, not only with this book, with her first book, Dead Aid, that we chose for one reason. We wanted this book for the kids to read and to get acquainted with her work. Her other publications and works and speeches are much more to the topic that we discussed this morning at a conference: financial crisis, the future of Europe, how we will develop in Europe, how we get back to the growth path. But I don't want to keep you much longer. Dambisa, the floor is yours. Our journalists will ask questions, or I think you should make a couple of remarks and then questions.
Okay. First of all, I'm delighted to be back in Austria. Thank you so much for hosting me, but also recommending me in this case. But also, it's an absolute pleasure to have been recognized and in the manner in which the Hayek Institute and the organization and affiliations have done. It really means a lot to me. I have to say, being a woman, I was slightly shocked to be receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award at this time, but I did recognize that I thought to myself, is it already that time in life? But suffice it to say that Friedrich Hayek, actually, his seminal book, he wrote many other books, but the one that really put him on the map, The Road to Serfdom, was actually written when he was 45. And I'm happy to say I'll be 45 in February, so I figured that would be a sort of a pivot point to see where, how it is the two of us could have been put together through the award. But as I said, I'm absolutely thrilled, delighted to be here. Very much I'm concerned and continue to be worried about the viability of Hayek's thinking and the idea, the important ideas and ideals of an individuality and the importance of these type of ideas in terms of forging ahead the human condition and the challenges that the world faces today. So I will stop there and I'm happy to take questions, but thank you again.
May I start? I think one question nobody can avoid in the moment is the shutdown in the United States, is the current situation, the whole debate around Obamacare. It all leads, how risky is this political game for the world economy?
So, I mean, clearly there are big risks. I was mildly reassured by reading that Nancy Pelosi thinks that it will be solved by the 17th. And I looked at the calendar and I said, but today is the 16th, so what is she talking about? We shall see what happens. I think that Obamacare is a superficial concern of what I see as a broader problem that the world is facing today, which is, on the one hand, there are many people who argue in many ways quite convincingly that the role of government, which is often intertwined with the size of government, has been very successful in ensuring economic development, in the case of China, in addressing the financial crisis. I mean, clearly there is something to be said about government efforts to remove us from the brink of a depression. But also looking to the future, particularly where Europe is concerned, it's pretty clear that the size of government will continue to grow given the demographic pressures. And in that regard, the question I think we're addressing is the role of the government going to only be in the provision of social safety nets, or is there a risk now that it's going to become much broader, and therefore we start to see economies looking much more like perhaps Scandinavian economies, but at the extreme more like China, where you have great government action in the economy. So those are some of the questions I think we're addressing. I think there's a more fundamental question which I hope to address this evening, which is why is it that we are living in a world where, as economists, you either are Keynesian in a pure sense, or you're Hayekian, and that there's no appreciation, there's no room to have any discussion about primarily the merits of both, but longer term, the risk that we will actually ignore going forward the real contribution of Hayek, and therefore really risk what I see as the long-term viability of the global economy. I think the concerns around totalitarianism, social unrest, these are things that Hayek wrote and talked about a lot, are things that we have downplayed and continue to downplay. And I actually am very worried about that as an artifact of the growing government, role of government that we see today.
Next question, or is there?
Regarding the growing government, are you talking about the United States and China only, or is it also a phenomenon that you would face in Europe?
Absolutely in Europe. Chancellor Merkel at Davos, the World Economic Forum this year, talked about this idea of 7-25-50, that Europe is 7% of the world's population, 25% of world GDP, but represents 50% of welfare payments of the world. If you add the United States to that number, you end up with 12% of the world population and about 88% of welfare payments. So clearly that's unsustainable. I mean, the majority of people on the planet live in the emerging world. 90% of the world's population is in the emerging world. So the notion that welfare payments are being skewed in such an aggressive way towards developed markets, and will continue to do so, because not only because of economic challenges that we continue to see in Spain and other places, but also because of demographic dynamics. That the aging population means that some of the tenets of Hayek individualism, incentives in policy and in actions will be harder and more difficult to implement. And I might also add the fact that we've underinvested in education, particularly in minority populations, but across countries like the United States. I mean, if you look at the OECD PISA statistics around education performance and in science and reading and mathematics, it's clear that we've underinvested for many decades, and that is not something we can remedy in the short term. So all of these problems create a confluence which to me suggests that the real risk that we're facing over the next several decades is that governments will continue not only to grow in size, but I think their scale of inefficiency will also continue to increase.
Rising the debt limit in the United States will not balance the budget. Yeah? I know it is much more difficult, yeah? But at the end of the day, as long as they just turn the screw for national defense a little bit, wouldn't this help a lot?
Well, I'm sure you have better numbers than I do, but you know, the United States at its very core is a military-industrial complex. So we can sit here and say, okay, reduce your military budget and deploy those funds towards education, you know, or towards some investment in infrastructure or something else in a public good. And that might sound credible. But the reality is that is not the culture at the heart of what the United States is. And so in many ways, I think what we're witnessing in the United States is not just an economic challenge, but a cultural challenge in the very sort of pure sense of the world. What is it that the United States stands for? And to my mind, the difficulty that they're struggling with is a recognition that perhaps longer term the viability of the United States as the premier economy in the world requires that they reevaluate their approach as a military-industrial complex. The fact of the matter is the OECD this year has, in March of this year, announced that they think China will be the largest economy in the world by 2016. The less aggressive estimates are more conservative estimates from the IMF. They say 2017 China will be the largest economy on a PPP basis. And I think for me, as somebody who comes from the emerging world, the question is, we're living in this amazing period of time where the two largest economies in the world have completely different political systems and completely different economic systems. And the question there becomes, where is the space for Hayekian values, which are really at the heart of long-term prosperity in this new world order? If China, when China becomes the largest economy and therefore becomes, in a sense, in a position to be the most credible. So I do think that debts and budgeting balances are absolutely essential. But and I'm sure we'll get into it. I think the bigger problem, aside from the cultural aspect of the United States, is that if you overlay that with the democratic process, which is in of itself myopic, that policymakers are rewarded for being short-term, then I do not think that we will see the resolution, a sort of sustainable resolution to some of the challenges that the U.S. is facing today.
So in other words, the incentive system that politicians are awarded with needs to be turned upside down.
And that's very difficult in a country which, again, is very wed to its cultural values. You know, the fact of the matter is, it's pretty clear. I mean, we all want to live in liberal democracies, but it's pretty clear that the economic policy making is so closely correlated to the political system, to the point that the decisions that policymakers make in the United States are very rational. So they're not irrational, they're very rational if you look specifically and narrowly at the myopia associated with their desire to be re-elected. So you're absolutely right that the real challenge is, can we actually overhaul some of these political systems. And again, I'll be talking a little bit about this tonight. Because if you look across the emerging world, places like Mexico, Brazil, but even Nigeria are reevaluating their constitutions to drive this wedge between political incentives and economic policy making. Specifically in the countries that I mentioned, they've got longer political terms. So you can have up to 8 years. In some cases they're looking at 10 years, 9-10 years, but you only get one term. And it just gives you enough flexibility to look at some of the long-term challenges such as education and infrastructure that governments are facing. But at the same time, you don't get into this cycle which you have in the United States where every 2 years there's another election. So government policymakers are rationally behaving in a way that's deleterious for the world economy.
There is one country that is probably a little bit different from that. If we look at Singapore, it's ranked #1 in all the world rankings of economic, whether it's economic freedom, whether it's prosperity, whether it's GDP per capita, you name it. However, this country is not a democracy in the Western sense, as we know. So how long can Singapore remain the way it is when the other countries are catching up? Or will the other countries never catch up?
So that's a wonderful question. I have to say I love being in Singapore. I always hope I'm angling to retire there one day. So the question of democracy I think is a very interesting one. Not least because that experiment of implementing democracy has been going on now for multiple decades. And I was just looking recently at some data. The fact of the matter is that it's been quite unsuccessful in terms of achieving liberal democracies around the world. So today, just to give you some data points, we have about 189 countries, I think, around the world. Of that number, 50% are considered democracies, but 70% of those democracies are illiberal democracies, in the sense that people do not have freedoms such as freedom of press, freedom of movement, etc. Now, to my mind, that's a failure, because that is not what we were aspiring to. We were aspiring to ensure that liberal democracy can be instituted in a very viable way. So the question then becomes, how do we get liberal democracy? And it's my contention that we had the sequencing wrong. I think our focus on shoehorning democracies around the world was not the appropriate way to do this, to ensure long-term lasting democracy. I think what we ought to have done was focus on economic policy first. And once you get the right economic policy in place and develop a middle class, you will then have a natural artifact of the middle class able to hold its government accountable. But this naturally brings us back to Hayek, because how do you have a system where people are incentivized to grow an economy, to participate, to have property rights, to be engaged in a society to the extent that they are vested in the economy and therefore want their government to behave? And to me, having a state-led approach of economic development does not get you there. I think what gets you there are Hayekian values, where you actually have incentive-built policies that drive people to actually do the right thing. So I'm afraid I'm less sanguine about the prospects of democracy. I was just telling my parents last week that there's as a bit of a joke, but it's quite tragic actually, that Azerbaijan had an election last week, Tuesday. And the incumbent, who's been in power for 10 years, was announced as by landslide victory that he won the election. There was only one problem. The voting had not started. Voting was supposed to start 24 hours later. And this is the type of world that we live in, because Azerbaijan will therefore will still be measured as a democracy in the success column. But actually, after 10 years and still clear manipulation of the ballot rigging and so on, it seems to me that we're failing at creating liberal democracy around the world.
to a side note, we have been with our free market roadshow in Azerbaijan, and we did a Liberty Fund conference there as well. And this is actually Chapman House rules only. And we were warned at the hotel, which was a Hyatt, everything is recorded, so our local guests would not speak up. They knew that, and this was 2012.
Dambisa, could you maybe also comment in this context? You wrote the book "The Winner Takes It All" on China. So how do you see China in this economic, political context going forward?
So the interesting news is that will be meeting the Chinese president on November 1st. So hopefully I'll have better answers. I'm sure he's not going to tell me a lot, but nevertheless, I think that China, to many people, politicians and policymakers, particularly in the emerging world, does hold out a model of economics and politics that is seen as viable. Now again, viable over what period of time? Because to my mind, if you don't have public policy that embeds incentives and the Hayekian sort of view of private property and individualism into your culture, I think that the concern is over the long term, the strength of prosperity, the ability to create economic growth and to continue to put a dent in poverty becomes questionable. However, because of the democratic challenges and the short-termism that we've talked about already, I think many governments around the world are finding that model to be quite appealing. It's very much the view, incorrectly I would say, that many policymakers think that free markets, liberal democracy, maybe less so, have clearly delivered economic growth and reduced poverty, but maybe for 60% of their population. So you've got 40% of the population that actually has not benefited from a lot of the policies that we know and love. I would argue that there's a whole list of protectionist activity, not just in the emerging market, but even in developed markets.
Agriculture is a major example.
Agriculture is a major example. Trade policies, I mean, just in the past 18 months, there have been over 130 documented protectionist policies from the EU. Things like outright protectionism, more subtle forms of export bans and so on. But that culture of, yes, we love democracy and free markets, but actually the core implementation, to me, suggests that we've not actually really tested the merits of what I think would be very beneficial, which is free markets.
In this context, maybe can you also comment on, because I remember I was 15 years when I spoke at school about European agricultural policy, that tomatoes with subsidized gas are brought to the European markets. Wow, you know, tomatoes from Africa will never be let into the European market, and unfortunately the situation still hasn't changed much, despite the costs, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of, let's say, development in all these countries. So that aid is here. Maybe you can comment on this context as well.
Well, you know, I think there's a clear political imperative for keeping the subsidies in place. I do not think those subsidies will ever go away. And I think the fact that European countries, but the United States also, are struggling, economic growth is paltry and there are lots of worries, I think that means it's even less likely that the notion that we would somehow scrap subsidies will occur. So I do not, and by the way, again, I try to be rational about these things. I understand the incentives. I understand why subsidies exist. I don't like them. I don't like things that distort the markets and actually we end up with massive deadweight losses. But I do understand that there's a political imperative. I mean, I was just in France. You know, who's going to stand up and tell the French farmers? You know, it's kind of who will bail the cat. Who is going to stand up and tell the French farmers, we're not going to give you any more subsidies now because there's somebody in Togo or in Mali or somewhere that people don't really care about who needs to benefit from that. So I really don't think we're going to see change. Now, does that mean that there are no alternatives? No. I mean, I think coming back to your question about China, China has 1.3 billion people, but 7% arable land. I think that that is a real opportunity for Africa, but South America as well, to be able to export agricultural produce, which is what they're doing. I know a lot of people in the Western media in particular don't like that because there's lots of criticism of China's role, but I think that it's a real opportunity for transforming lives to have the engagement with China.
One last question from our side before, just since we were talking about your books, and the second book was How the West Was Lost.
Yes.
And we have seen policies that have just prolonged the problem, no solutions in sight, at least from a libertarian perspective.
Sure.
How do you view the European concept right now? What do you think can be done or should be done? We have elections ahead next year, May 23rd to 24th to 26th. So is there a visionary, a leader, as we had with Lady Thatcher, for example, who could turn around, or will it go on with the one-size-fits-all politics that doesn't bring any results? How do you view this?
I think my gut right now is more the latter than the former. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that free market type of thinking is out of vogue. And actually, my concern is that because of these dynamics I mentioned earlier, China's success with this role of state, ostensible success, I mean, this is within the context of a short period of time, relatively short period of time, but China's success, the fact that we did not go into a depression because governments cut interest rates and have been clearly, in many ways, inflating the world economy. The fact that demographic pressures in the West, in particular, are going to put a continued burden on government. These things, to me, suggest there's really no space to have a discussion about market economics. That doesn't mean that people like myself and yourself should give up. But I do think that we're going into a period of time where it will be less fashionable rather than more fashionable. And again, talking about incentives, I just don't think that any public policy maker right now is incentivized to come out and talk about free markets and the importance of free markets, I'm afraid to say. I think that the balance is very skewed, and unfortunately, which was going to be my fourth point, there's no subtlety in this discussion. The problem is that public policy has been hijacked by heretics. So you end up with these extremes, and there's no opportunity to say, okay, I understand what you're saying. Why don't we try and come up with something balanced? The fact of the matter is that you have to pick a side and you have to stay on that side. And public policy makers, even in private, I mean, Dead Aid is a good example. In private, they would say, we agree with you 100%. But in public, they knew that the viability of their institutions relies on them saying, no, we need to give more aid to Africa. And it's the same now. In private, people might say, you know what, we agree, we understand we need to continue to incentivize people to work in order to create economic growth and to reduce poverty and create jobs. But in public, that's not going to win you votes. So I'm afraid we're going into a place that I think is going to be a very dark place for free marketeers like myself.
So since you published the book Dead Aid, nothing has changed in global policy regarding...
Oh, enormous things have changed. I mean, this book came out in January 2009. Since then, we've seen the debts and deficits of Western donors, at a minimum.
Towards the positive.
Oh yeah, no, but I think that, to me, that's positive. I think it's great that they were not able to then continue to write checks because they had to reevaluate their policies on a very rational basis. I mean, forgetting the emotions of it, they had to come to accept that it's ridiculous for the United States to borrow money from China so that they're going to be giving aid to Africa. I mean, this is logic, but they obviously were not thinking about that during the bull market. But other things that have happened, I was just counting, there have been at least 11 countries in Africa that have issued debt in the capital markets. Again, to me, I think capital markets are an essential tool for any government that wants to have credibility. And so my own country, Zambia, Ghana just a few weeks ago, Nigeria, they've all come to bond markets, issued debt. It's essential for the governments to be held accountable, and the markets are very good at doing that. They're not perfect, but they're much better than public check writing. So that's also happened. Obviously, the rise of China over the past 10 years, much more in the past 7 years, its imprimatur in these regions means that the discussion has moved away from we'll just sit back and continue to accept sort of policy advice from country in the West and also take money, which, by the way, Western governments know that Western economies have not succeeded because of aid, but that's a prescription they're willing to pass out to somebody else. That whole thinking has changed. And now with China going into these countries, China's not giving out aid, nowhere near to the scale that the West has. They are very focused on business and engagement and trying to create jobs both in China, but also as an artifact is that the externalities for jobs in South America and Africa. So that's another thing that's changed a lot. The discourse in public policy making with South American and African leaders that I spent time with has changed completely. They know they're very much more actively engaged. I was at the Jackson Hole for the Federal Reserve meeting in August. They're worried about what the consequences of quantitative easing are going to be, how we're going to withdraw, what are the implications for inflation and for weakening of currencies and capital flows. That is not a discussion that I think anybody from South America or Africa would have been really actively involved in 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. But now they're taking more responsibility for their economies. So I actually think I would like to take all the credit, but I'm sure that other factors have happened.
I can also say from a microfinance perspective, before 2008, what we have seen is when microfinance developed, because of the Nobel Prize, I started my fund just a year before. Like I had a discussion in Austria, the public institutions discovered microfinance, but having no expertise, giving out blank checks for anything and just crowding out more or less the private options, which I think are the better options. And I can confirm what you said now, that has gone, at least in many areas. So the allocation of resources, I think, is much more efficient and beneficial to the developing countries.
So, as I understood it, you see the role of China in Africa as mainly positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact of the matter, and again, maybe it's because I'm sort of brainwashed into being more about individual liberties and free markets and so on. But what do these economies need? They need trade, they need infrastructure, they need job creation, they need foreign direct investment. China is delivering all of those things. It's not for free, which is really important. It's not just handouts. This is about engagement. And are there challenges? Are there issues? Of course there are. But I would argue that on balance, in terms of the provision of these things, ability to trade, I mean, Africa with 1 billion people is less than 2% of world trade. That's absurd. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know over 300 years of economic success in the West, that trade has been an essential pillar for economic success. So the notion that we expect African economies to grow when Africa, which has not just resources in terms of natural resources, such as mining and minerals, but also land. It's got the most untilled arable land left on the planet. This is an economy that is less than 2% of world trade. I mean, there's something wrong there. And so the fact that China is now the leading trade partner, not just in Africa, but in places like Brazil, the #1 trading partner, Colombia, Chile, means that it is actually putting a mark on these continents that we've been waiting for. Job creation is important, infrastructure. I mean, I actually think infrastructure, although tends to be a public good, I do think there's a lot of scope for private investments in infrastructure right now. And the fact that China is going in there, I think is setting a hedge, and many other private sector investors are now following to also follow suit. I mean, those are transformations that have not occurred in Africa for 50 years.
Isn't there also danger that Africa is selling out to China?
I don't know what that means.
Especially because the Chinese are mainly going for the resources.
Yeah.
Well, let me just clarify, first of all, on the resource point. Today there are about almost 20 stock exchanges in Africa. 85% of the stocks that trade in Africa are non-commodities. They're not commodities. So that's rule number one, is we've got to get out of this mindset that Africa equals commodities, because that's a problem. They're technology stocks, they're banking stocks, insurance companies, retail goods companies. I mean, this is a fact. You can go and check. You don't have to rely on me. The second thing is when people say Africa is selling out, I'm not entirely clear what that means. Because on the one hand, as an African, my view is it is not only a desire, but it's the responsibility of the international community to allow Africa and Africans to be equal partners on the global stage. So, I've said to a number of people, if you say to me, listen, Dambisa, I'm sorry, but I think Africans should not have democracy and Africans should not have governments, their own governments, that's a different discussion. But if you're telling me that you think that Africans deserve to have democratic governments and deserve to have improvements in their economic situation, then it must be the case that we need to be able to trade. So I don't know what selling out means. We need to be part of the global economy. So in any other place in the world, you would find it objectionable that a country, a continent of the size of Africa, with 1 billion people, this is just about the size of India, close to the size of China, is less than 2% of world trade. It's less than 2% of foreign direct investment. Why do we find it objectionable? We find it objectionable because we don't have faith in the African leadership.
I would say we don't have faith in the Chinese leadership regarding.
No, we have faith in the Chinese. China is the largest lender to the United States. Believe me, we have faith in the Chinese leadership. We don't have faith in the African leadership. I mean, Americans are very happy to take Chinese money, as are Europeans. They don't have a problem with. They don't even have a problem with human rights when it's coming to take Chinese money. But somehow, when the Chinese go to Africa or South America, we're up in arms. What about human rights? What about slavery? What about neocolonialism? We have a long list of concerns. That, to me, suggests that we're actually concerned about the quality of leadership in Africa, which is a valid concern. But then, let's not just superficially have that discussion. Let's take it one step down. Why are we worried about the quality of leadership in Africa? We are worried about the quality of leadership in Africa because we know that the incentive structure currently, particularly the aid system, encourages and attracts people who don't have to do any work. They're not held in any way accountable to their people or to the international community as a whole for the delivery of improvements of quality of life for their people. And therefore, we know exactly who we have in power in these places. And that's what we're worried about, because we know that those people, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, will be very happy to sell off their resources. Thankfully, because of the financial crisis and because obviously traditional donors are struggling, that is also now being challenged. We now have Africans being able to say, we're not going to tolerate this. We're not happy with the labor standards in our country. We're not happy with the terms of this deal. But that is so essential. It's at the heart of liberal democracy that we have to be able to hold our governments accountable. Not somebody else. We have to be able to do that. And so I feel it's a very good thing. It's time for Africa now, and South America also, because I see this pattern all over South America. It's time for our leadership to actually be held accountable, but also to grow up. They're not children. They have to understand what the implications of being part of the global economy are.
Can you name some countries where this evolution is on a good way? Some African countries and some where
Rwanda, across East Africa, Kenya. Some of the changes that have happened there. I can tell you there are now about 18 countries in Africa that have credit ratings. That never happened. 10, 20 years ago, no countries in Africa had credit ratings, and not only that, they were being told by international institutions, do not get credit ratings. Because why do African countries need to go to the capital markets? Don't go to the capital markets, you just continue to rely on aid. But why? We have over 300 years of evidence of what successful economics looks like. We're complicating matters. We know trade is a good thing. We know foreign direct investment is a good thing. Innovation is a good thing. So the question is, why are we now going to give aid to countries when there's not a single country, not one country in the history of the world has achieved economic development and reduced poverty by relying on aid to the extent that Africa does today? So why are we pushing a policy that we know doesn't work? So this to me was the essence of this book, but it's more than that. This book and all my work is about incentives. It's about having the correct incentives, whether it's in how the West was lost, about Western public policy and how the incentives in public policy are so wrong that they have deteriorated and have made worse capital, labor, and productivity, which are the three key aspects of growth. Whether it's about China and the race for commodities, why is it that commodity scarcity is such a big issue and we don't seem to care about it? It's not even on any of the big agendas. We've got environmental groupings, we've got Basel looking at financial markets, we've got World Trade Organization. We don't have a single agency that looks at commodity risks. So to me, it is about incentives, and ultimately we will ultimately end up with public policy and politicians. Coming back to your question about your elections next year, we will have the politicians that we deserve.
Unfortunately.
Yes. Actually, we had a discussion today where someone said, history always repeats, and he's so pessimistic. And I said, absolutely not. I believe in evolution, so we create the present and the future. And if you think of Africa or any emerging market, my firm belief is they have a huge advantage. They can start from, let's say, point zero in some areas. And if you look at mobile payment system in Kenya or some other really, let's say, technological improvements in many countries, this is just the proof it works if they have, as Dambisa said, the incentives in place. So it's rather the system which prevents the people from going out. And in our case as Europeans, sometimes I guess it's our projection into history, what we have done wrong, that we think everybody must do the same thing in the future. But as I said, history does not repeat. There's all the options as soon as people are being given a chance to develop and to flourish. And I always said, because they say about education, I say just give an iPad to any African country, and I'm sure within a very short period of time the young people start to read, write, and make a different future. And not just, as Dambisa put out so well in her book, spoil the leaders and give them blank checks for not doing the right things. And that's very much overlooked in our European perspective. All my discussions, also sometimes with governmental bodies, they have a very strange way of not seeing how these people can flourish and how they cannot flourish with them just giving money to the wrong people.
So your suggestion would be to stop all financial aid, or how would you suggest?
So I get asked that question a lot, and then I realized people they actually didn't read the book. They probably just read
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You may read it after.
On page 7 of the book, I'll spare you. It's on page 7 of this book. I was very clear that there are different types of aid, and this is really important in terms of addressing public policy. The first type of aid is humanitarian aid. So to me, there's a clear moral imperative. If there's a flood or a typhoon, whether it's Katrina in the US or it's tsunami, I think we have an imperative to act. It doesn't matter. These are human beings. There's a moral aspect that says we should step in and act. So my book was not about that type of aid. The second type of aid is NGO aid, which to me, I know people, especially now going into Christmas period, you see it all over, especially Western television. Look at this poor child in Ethiopia, or this one needs a well in Peru, please send $20. I personally find it irritating that African children are being used to raise money in the manner that they are. But I'm not talking about that type of aid either, because that's small beer. It's relatively small amounts compared to the third type of aid, which is what this book is about, which is the large multi-billions of dollars that go from developed countries to developing countries every year. And those particularly have weak or no conditionalities, and governments, the whole list of issues around inflation, corruption, debt burden, the political erosion of the political democratic system that we talked about. So there's a whole list of reasons why that's problematic, and that's what's in the book.
Dr. Moyo, just one quick question. Do you think it could be problematic both in Africa and in South America that, in a way China is a very good influence, but also the way China deals is mostly government agreement. You know, a totalitarian government on the one hand, and the corrupt governments on the other. So, in economics, it's very important how you assign, you know, the assets, and that's key, and that's and mostly entrepreneurs do it better than governments.
Absolutely.
Don't you see there might be a problem in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely risks of deadweight losses to society. I mean, I think it's not just from China. I think we've got a long history of government action. I mean, the state was a very big part before Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came into play in the 80s. The world was run by states, and it was clear that there were massive dislocations and misallocation of resources in that scenario. I think that the risks that you describe exist, but you know, I've already said here and in my work, my view is that longer term governments need to think about figuring out how to incentivize people to do the right things and to bring incentives back into public policy, but also for politicians. However, I do worry that that's not where the world is right now. And so, yes, I hope that somehow, and I worry because I do think, again, going back to what Hayek was talking about, the larger governments, particularly because of inefficiencies, I think that you get higher risks of totalitarianism, bad outcomes in the political space. And that, to me, is a big worry. So, yes, I do worry about it. I particularly worry about it because I think the world is moving much further away from free markets, and both in developed and developing countries. And so the question is, what does the world look like in 50 years? Well, you know, I hope it doesn't end up with a situation where we end up seeing much more social unrest. I mean, this year we've had unrest, of course, ongoing in Middle East, North Africa, the Arab Spring. We've had problems in Turkey, we've had problems in Colombia, as we're speaking, we've had problems in Brazil. You know, the proximate, superficial reason for those problems may be different, but to me the underlying problem is the same, that we have a problem where there are a lot of people looking to improve their livelihoods, and the middle class has been growing, but people now are getting impatient. Things are not working as well as they have in the past, and I think that the government reaction in that type of a scenario around the world will be to pivot towards more state intervention rather than less, with the consequences that I just talked about, that I think that we end up with higher risks rather than lower.
May I add a question? We all believe, at least as Austrian economists, we believe in innovation and creative processes. So innovation has always gotten us out of problems, and we advanced. Mm-hmm. So isn't this picture too dark? No, too dark that you draw? I mean, we have been on the defense side in the past decades as libertarians and free market economists. So I don't mind fighting and being on the, standing on the wall there. But the fact that we have innovation process and that the world is getting better in this way. Doesn't this make it easier for everybody? Especially if we don't want to make the rich poor, but we want to make the poor richer. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, this has happened in the past decades. Mm-hmm. But if we look back at Hayek's interview, the famous one that he gave to the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in the 80s, when he said there will always be the least and worst off 10%. Mm-hmm. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. But those poor people from the 80s are now elevated and are better off. So shouldn't we be a little bit more positive given the idea of innovation?
So I think you're asking me two questions in a strange way, because I think, not in a bad way, but in a strange way.
Complicated.
No, I think that you've linked them, which I find very interesting. And I'll tell you why, because the point of innovation has clearly bailed us out on many occasions. So let's take the last book I wrote, which was about commodities. People asked me on a number of occasions, okay, so why are you worried about commodity scarcity now? We've had Malthus in 1798, we've had Club of Rome in the 1970s, we've heard this before, but guess what? Who cares?
Nothing happened.
Nothing ever happened. You know, the price of oil for multiple decades was $20. It was just at $20. It never moved. So why are you worried now? Well, in that particular instance, it's because we are at a very, very unique time in the history of the world. This is the first time where our population is growing at an insane level. I mean, India is putting 1 million people every single month. 1 million people every month are added. And the world is putting in an additional Germany, which is about 60 million, over 60 million people every single year on the population. I mean, this trend and explosion of population is only since the 1960s. I mean, before 1960, the world population was 3 billion. We're now going to be, you know, we're going to be 8, 9 billion, actually 10 billion by 2100. And that's the first time we'll see it plateauing out. So I can come up with scenarios that say we're in a very unique time. Malthus wasn't wrong. You know, he just couldn't predict the innovation point. We've been bailed out, but there is an issue about where we are specifically today. Malthus would have been absolutely right. I think he would have been spot on if he had recognized that we're going to be this many people on the planet. So that's one thing I would say. To your point about people being better off, it's a very interesting point, because one of the things I've been trying to do is to take myself out of my sort of free marketeer, sort of Hayekian hat, and take my hat off, go to the emerging world and spend time even in Western countries and try to be quite objective about what's happening. And I will tell you the following regarding globalization. And later on I will share with you a slide. I don't have it on me at the moment, but I have it in my room. I'll give it to you because I think it's very interesting. This is work that comes from the University of Chicago, who are, I would say, more on our side in terms of thinking about free markets. But they have found that they do a comparison between two periods, 1950 to 1980, which they consider to be pre-globalization, mainly nation-state isolationist, versus 1980 to 2007, which was much more globalized. And they look at income inequality, they look at the performance of the rich, and as you know, I'm sure that actually on measures such as income inequality, people are poorer in developed countries. You are right to say that the world as a whole is better off, because people in the emerging markets have done much better. But the problem is, going back to the question that you asked a few minutes ago, I'm not talking about a rejection of Hayekian values that's coming only from the emerging markets. I'm talking about a rejection of Hayekian values that's coming from developed markets, largely because people have not seen their wealth improve over the period of globalization.
In other words, the middle class, for example,
Correct.
in Europe is
Correct.
declining
Correct.
and getting poor.
Correct. And let me start with one statistic, which I think captures everything that I've just said. I mentioned to you, we're living at this very interesting time. The United States, $15 trillion leading economy, democracy as its political paradigm, and private markets, ostensibly with a small p, as its economic stance. China, about $8 trillion GDP. Second largest economy, will be the first in the next 5 years, let's say. It has no democracy and it has state capitalism. These two countries have the same income inequality. Identical income inequality, 0.47. So this is a question I get asked all over the emerging world. They say, which one would you pick? Which model do you pick? Because here, for many countries around the world, income inequality is a very important measure. Not only do the US and China have the exact same income inequality, China's income inequality has been improving. And the income inequality of the United States has been getting worse. So these are the questions that I am trying to address as somebody who says, no, free markets are really important. I want them to follow the Western model. But they say, wait a second, these are the countries that have social networks, so social safety nets, over almost 90% of the world's. So these are the questions. I know you're familiar with this, but this is how these are the questions I worry about. And I know you had a I'm not sure if I answered.
Coming back to social unrest and China's performance in Africa, it's not really contradictory to what you said, but how I experienced it, China needs to get more resources to keep its economy running, simply because they need 7 to 8% growth to avoid social unrest.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the only other thing that one very senior Chinese policymaker said to me, which I think is a very interesting point, which was, we need those resources if we are to continue to have a system of economics that mirrors and reflects the system of economics in the West. Now, to your point about innovation, tomorrow if you can get water from a stone, maybe it won't be an issue. But there's another question which they're dealing with right now, and this is way beyond my abilities. But there's a question about, and this is on a different level. This is not anywhere near anything I can speak about, but I think it's very interesting. The question is, if we were able, we meaning the Chinese were able to come up with a living standard measure or a way of life that was not hitched to how many televisions you have, how many holidays you take, is there a way that resource inputs in the way that we think about them could become more irrelevant? Now, that thankfully I'm not a Chinese policymaker, because I don't know how you address that question. With 7% arable land, 1.3 billion people, they want to be in the middle class. I don't know where you're going to get those resources, and that's what my book was about, because the resources are dwindling around the world: water, arable land, minerals, and energy.
Will you address this question on the 1st of November?
I'm going to go there and listen.
Okay.
I've realized going there and offering opinions, I'm sure from my experience with the Chinese, they're very good at saying, no, what do you think? And they sit there and the rest of us, this is what I think, and you need democracy, you need this, you need that. And then you leave there and you realize you didn't get anything from them. So I'm going to be very hard to try and not say anything and listen to what they have to say for a change.
Well, do you have any further questions? Well, with that, let me thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Maybe you want to sign
Sure,
this
I'm happy to sign.
for Magister Steindorfer, and that you can read it. And feel free to enjoy
Thank
lunch.
you so much.
Thank you very much, Dambisa.
That was
We're
my
looking,
pleasure.
we're
Thank you.
looking forward to tonight and
Thank
to
you
the
so
message
much.
you will provide to not only the students but to our audience. Thank you for joining us.